The NFL Combine is right around the corner, so it's time to talk about the NFL Draft. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you all for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Hello, everyone. My name is Zach Hicks, your resident film nerd and I guess draft nerd as well over at horseshoehuddle.com. My partner, Jake Arthur, is not here today, but we still have a fun show planned for you guys. We're going to talk all about the NFL draft, but we're going to talk about it through the lens of Build-a-Ballard and the Indy Draft Guide. So we're going to talk all about the Build-a-Ballard series, some guys I'm excited to watch for the Build-a-Ballard series at the NFL Combine next week. But before we get into Build-a-Ballard, I do want to talk about the Indy Draft Guide. If you guys did not purchase the Indy Draft Guide the last 2 years, it is available for the third time now this year, the 2025 Indy Draft Guide, where you guys get 225 individualized scouting reports. You get Build-a-Ballard, obviously, for every single position. You get new in-depth features, and you get how each player fits the Colts. It's a very specific draft guide to Colts fans and to people who follow the draft from Indy. Again, this is the third time we've been releasing the Indy Draft Guide. I particularly write up the offensive line for the guide, but other guys who participate in writing up the guide do a fantastic job. Last year, I think we had, a couple hundred people purchased the guide, which was awesome. We're trying to get back around that number again this next season. So yeah, if you guys have not purchased the Indy Draft Guide or pre-ordered the Indy Draft Guide, I have the link right there. I'm going to have the link in the show notes. And I kind of want to go over a couple things about the Indy Draft Guide if you guys aren't super familiar with it. So to kind of kick this off, let's look at some of the pages from last year on players the Colts ended up selecting. So starting off with Laiatu Latu. If you guys are watching on video, I have a picture of what the guide looks like on here. If you guys are, again, listening on audio, we will put it in the show notes so you guys can figure that, check those out, on your own time there. But Laiatu Latu, we had a first-round grade on Laiatu Latu last season. We weren't super, super high on him compared to other draft analysts. We had him as the third ranked edge rusher in the class. And we had I think we were pretty spot on with this write-up here. The strengths about how he's a prototypical edge rusher, how he's a guy who can win with his, humongous toolbox as a pass rusher. But some of the issues were with his pad level, with his inability to out-athlete guys, and some of his inconsistencies as a run defender. And I think all those things kind of played out in his rookie season. When we look at what Latu looked like as a rookie, again, you saw the flashes with the pass rushing technique and with the fundamentals. We saw the forced fumbles and his ability to make plays, but there is still some development needed in his game in terms of his overall ability to out-athlete tackles, out-power tackles. Like, those are really the areas that he needs to improve on. So we had him as our first-round grade last year. The Colts took him in the first round. Maybe it was a little bit of a reach compared to the Indy Draft Guide, but we had Jared Verse over him, so technically that one came out pretty well as well. The player comp at the bottom of the guide thing here, it got cut off in the screenshot I did, but we had Whitney Merciless as the player comp, and I think through 1 year, that's a pretty decent comp looking so far. So yeah, I think this guide here, look, you guys can see all the info that you get with each player profile. You get the background, you get the size, the fits, you get the stats, you get the strengths, weaknesses, how he fits the Colts, you get the player comp and how well he fits the team in terms of team fit. So a lot of information there all on one page. Let's look at another player who didn't perform as well as Laiatu Latu last year for the Colts, and that is wide receiver A.D. Mitchell. We had a second-round grade on A.D. Mitchell. He went in the second round to the Colts, so the Colts were not reaching by our standards there. If you look at his background here, a lot of strengths are greater for wide receivers. Absolutely loved A.D. Mitchell. But I do think some of the weaknesses did rear their ugly head in terms of how unrefined he was as a route runner and how unrefined he was just as an overall player. The one thing that really didn't translate, though, from the strengths and even from the weaknesses when we're looking at this page is, AD Mitchell is a really good contested catch guy in college. Didn't really show up as much on his rookie film. So sometimes things don't translate exactly in year one. The contested catch stuff really didn't translate, but I do think a lot of the other things here, especially when you look at the athleticism, when you look at his ability to win in his routes, to create separation, I think the AD Mitchell write-up did age pretty well. And again, second round pick. The player comp was Devontae Parker. And through 1 year, it's hard to really argue with the Devontae Parker player comp. Honestly, through 1 year, if he gets to Devontae Parker level, I think we would be a little happy, considering his first year with the Colts was not great. So yeah, I mean, hopefully he can surpass the Devontae Parker comp going forward. But that's what we have him as of right now, and that's where we had him in the Indy Draft Guide last year. And then one more. This was one that I wrote up last year on offensive tackle Matt Gonsalves. Now, I wasn't as high on Gonsalves as the Indianapolis Colts were. I had a 5th round grade on Gonsalves, and I had his player comp being Jackson Barton, which was a former Colts draft pick in the 7th round years ago. So I did label Gonsalves as a high fit for the Colts because he is exactly what the Colts look for in an offensive tackle. And while my overall round grade was much lower than where the Colts took him, I had a 5th rounder. The Colts trade up to get him in the 3rd round. I do think a lot of the strengths and weaknesses played out really well on his rookie film for the Colts this year, where I was very high on Gonsalves from his athletic standpoint, from his size standpoint, from his run blocking. I really liked what he could bring to an NFL team, in particular the Colts, but I did think some of the play strength issues, I did think some of the pass blocking and some of the technique in pass blocking need to get better. And again, if we look at Gonsalves' rookie season, he graded out as a pretty good run blocker, below average pass blocker, needs to get stronger, needs to get more technically sound. So I think for the most part, those did age out pretty well. And those are just 3 of the 225 individualized reports that you guys would get in the Indy Draft Guide. So if you guys are interested in checking that out, check the link in the show notes. The link that's also running on the video here if you're on YouTube watching this. The Indy Draft Guide, a really cool resource just to, again, follow the draft, get in-depth information on each prospect and player, get features on which players fit the Colts and which players would be great fits for the team. And just get all that information that you need. You kind of can get, Jake and I talk about hundreds of prospects on this show throughout draft season, but you still miss some players. There are still some players who fall through the cracks. When you have it all out in a guide form like that and have it all out just in, write-up form, you get all that information. So all those players that fall through the cracks on an audio platform like this, you get it all right there in one place in your Indy Draft Guide. So definitely check that out. If you guys haven't before, I highly recommend it. I have a lot of fun writing it up, and it's a great place to get some things on like my thoughts and other people's thoughts on the NFL draft. So again, that's the Indy Draft Guide. You guys can check it out in the show notes below. But coming up, we're going to talk about an aspect of the Indy Draft Guide that's been running even longer than Draft Guide, and that is Build-a-Ballard. The Build-a-Ballard series, the thing that I don't want to say put me on the map here with the Indianapolis Colts fan base, but it's something that has been an ongoing series where we try to identify players that fit the Chris Ballard mold, and it's been relatively successful over the years. So we're going to talk about the Build-a-Ballard series and kind of how it lends itself to project Colts draft picks in upcoming drafts. So we're going to talk about that here in just a second. But first, when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started. There's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. And so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game just exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is so easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, Locked On Colts everydayers. So we talked about the Indy Draft Guide. That is my baby the last couple of seasons. But my other baby is the Build-a-Ballard series. So if you guys don't know what that is, from my writing with SB Nation back, years ago. I mean, gosh, SB Nation, it's almost 4 or 5 years ago at this point, to even now with Sports Illustrated. When I'm writing about the Colts and draft season, I had the idea years ago to really try to identify what type of players fit Chris Ballard. And a big part of this series is about the athletic profile of players he's drafted at certain positions. So if we're looking at a defensive end, we look at the measurables of every defensive end that Chris Ballard has drafted. What are the common traits? Do they all have a certain arm length? Do they all have a certain explosiveness? Do they all have a certain, 40 time? That's kind of what this series does. It tries to isolate those certain testing aspects to find which guys fit the Chris Ballard mold. And we're able to kind of build this picture of what Chris Ballard likes in the draft. It's a very imperfect series. It's subjective too at times. There is a subjective element to it. But I do think it is one of those things where, if you have a bullseye, it typically hits somewhere on the bullseye. It's not going to be perfect in the middle every single time, but I do think we can get a rough estimation of what the Colts are looking for in the draft. Now, one thing I do want to add about this series, because I know there will be comments about this and people talk about this series is not about finding the best player for the Colts, because look, the Colts don't always draft the best player. We've seen time and time again, they don't always draft the best player. It's about finding the players that the Colts typically like. There are other series out there we're talking about players that would make the Colts better, writing up these big articles about Brock Bowers being awesome because he's such a great prospect. But this series is more so about Chris Ballard likes this mold of player. This mold of player is in the draft. So therefore, he might like this player in the draft. That's kind of what this series is looking for. And again, this is like year 7, I think, of Build-a-Ballard. We've started this thing back in 2020. And again, I just want to talk about the subjective nature of this too. Like, there is an objective part of it, which is the arm length, the testing and stuff like that. But there is subjective in there. I mean, one of my bigger misses last season was with AD Mitchell, because again, if we do like 80% of this is about the testing, AD Mitchell for 80% of it was the perfect Build-a-Ballard wide receiver. But the subjective part, I didn't fully believe that with some of the talk surrounding AD Mitchell with his struggles as a run blocker and on film and at the college level with some of his inconsistencies, my subjective side of it kind of came in and pushed him down to being a tier 2 guy instead of a tier 1 Build-a-Ballard guy. And, looking back on that, maybe I should have just put it all on the traits and let it up there. But that is where this series has some of that push and pull. There is some imperfect aspects of it. But it is a really fun series just to look at where Chris Ballard could go come draft day. We've had some really big hits in the past as well. I mean, just looking at, top 100 picks, Alec Pierce. I mean, the year that Alec Pierce was drafted, I was proclaiming him the perfect Build-a-Ballard wide receiver. He was the guy that Chris Ballard was going to sell his soul for. And then when it came to draft day, I mean, the Colts jumped on the opportunity to draft Pierce in round 2. Juju Brents was kind of the same thing when it came to cornerbacks. I mean, Juju Brents just checked every single box for what Chris Ballard likes at corner in terms of size, in terms of explosiveness, in terms of just everything. Honestly, Juju Brents and Alec Pierce are probably the biggest wins of the series in terms of those were the two guys that we kind of should have known that Ballard was going to draft just based off the testing, off the size, and off of how they fit with the team. Some other minor ones, though, that really checked the boxes and did some good things for the series, like Kwity Paye. I wrote in the Build-a-Ballard back in his draft year that this was the home run pick for the Colts in terms of Build-a-Ballard because he just checked every single box. Bernhard Raimann, I mean, if you're looking for the perfect Build-a-Ballard offensive tackle, Bernhard Raimann very much fit in terms of the size, the athleticism, even the arm length. Ballard likes the shorter-armed offensive tackles, so Bernhard Raimann was just perfect there. And then Rock Ya-Sin, and Rock Ya-Sin to a degree was kind of the subjective hit in terms of, he didn't check every single athletic box, but there was something about Rock Ya-Sin, that Senior Bowl, the single-digit guy at Temple who had the clean off-field, everything kind of clicked for Rock Ya-Sin in that draft season in terms of being a guy that Ballard would covet. And they didn't hesitate to take him very early in round 2, much earlier than I expected the Colts to take him. So again, a lot of this series is looking at the athletic traits, but there is a little bit of subjectiveness to it. And part of my own little touch on it. But talking about some of the misses, just to be very candid and open with you guys about this series, some of the misses, Laiatu Latu last year was probably my biggest miss I've ever had in the series, probably the only first-round pick since this series has started that I've just completely whiffed on. And Laiatu Latu didn't check any box, really, for the Build-a-Ballard series. He had shorter arms than the defensive ends Ballard has taken. He had like worse explosion scores and just testing numbers. The production in college was great, but in the past, Ballard didn't really care about production. And as a result, Latu didn't even come close to making Build-a-Ballard last year. So definitely one of the bigger misses there. Josh Downs has to be one of the craziest draft picks, one of the most unexpected draft picks I've ever seen in the Ballard era because of this series, where I'm like, look, every single wide receiver Ballard's ever taken has been this big, strong, like 6'4", 210-pound receiver that can jump out of the gym. I never would have expected a 5'9", 170-pound receiver, 180-pound wide receiver. But it was hard to deny Josh Downs' film in college, and obviously it led to the Colts taking him, and he's been a fantastic player since. And basically any player that doesn't test as well I consider kind of a miss, because you take away so much of what this series looks at here. So those are really the big misses of the series, and I think there is a way to clean that up a little bit. But for the most part, I mean, I think this series is a really fun way just to identify who really fits the Colts. And going back to the Indy Draft Guide, with the Indy Draft Guide, you get that Build-a-Ballard for every single position. When you're looking at for just away from the Indy Draft Guide, you only get like 3 positions for Sports Illustrated. So I try to do as much as possible for that draft guide. For Sports Illustrated, you'll still get like cornerback fits and safety fits and all that. But for the Indy Draft Guide, you'll get the full breakdown of Build-a-Ballard and the guys that perfectly fit this team come draft season. But transitioning away from what Build-a-Ballard is, because I do think a lot of you guys know what it is. It's been around for a good amount of years at this point. You guys at least know the term Build-a-Ballard. Let's transition to this draft class and look at some players where, if I'm looking at their Senior Bowl measurements already, if I'm just looking at their general measurements, some guys going into the NFL Combine next week that I already have pre-circled for Build-a-Ballard, guys who just, again, off of their measurements or just off their vibe are good Chris Ballard hits, and they just needed to nail the testing next week at the NFL Combine. Alrighty, Locked On Colts Everydayers. That was a lot of precursor to this final segment. We're really looking at guys at the NFL Combine that really fit this Colts team just already, and they just need to do the next step, which is kill it at the Combine. But wide receiver Jaden Higgins from Iowa State is a guy that I have circled many, many times. I've looked at his film too. The film is really, really good. He's so smooth and he's so big. And one thing that I think is interesting with the Build-a-Ballard series is that it struggles to predict kind of like where the series will go with a new coach. So with the coaching changes, like we knew what Matt Eberflus and Ballard were drafting at defensive end in those early years with Ben Banigou, Kamoko Toure, what was the other guy's name that was in there? Yeah, Kamoko Toure, Ben Banigou. I mean, even Kwity Paye was a Matt Eberflus. Like Matt Eberflus was there when they took him there, and they were all kind of that same mold of pass rusher. Then you get Gus Bradley coming in, and the next high pick they spent on pass rushers, Laiatu Latu, who is nothing like the other ones there. We've kind of seen that at wide receiver as well, where Alec Pierce, Mike Strawn, Des Patman, those were all Frank Reich wide receivers. Then Shane Steichen comes in, and you get Josh Downs and A.D. Mitchell, who are a little bit smaller. I mean, A.D. Mitchell's a little bit smaller, Josh Downs way smaller, and they're big-time separators. Jaden Higgins, to me, though, is kind of the merger of Frank Reich and Shane Steichen wide receiver, and I think that's why he fits the Colts really well. If the Colts were to go wide receiver in this draft, I don't think they will, but I think Jaden Higgins would be a good fit, and just in terms of he's a 6'4", 215-pound wide receiver who can separate with ease, great feet. He's going to test really well. I think he's going to be a guy that the Colts, like, again, if they were to go wide receiver, they would really consider him. I don't think they're going to go that route, but you never know. You never know with the Colts here. Getting to some positions that I do think they will consider, though, offensive tackle / interior offensive line, Wyatt Milam from West Virginia. Again, that's 6'6", the 32-inch arms, the 310 pounds. He's a guy who can play offensive guard, can play tackle. Maybe for the Colts system, they would have him at tackle. I think that's the type of guy that they would really covet there. And, just on film, the way he moves, he's a bit more athletic, but the way he moves does remind me of like a Will Fries type guy. So maybe they do push him to the inside if they were to look at him in like round 2, round 3. And he could be like a Will Fries replacement in the disaster scenario that they don't re-sign Will Fries. So Wyatt Milam can make some sense there. If you're looking for more like late day 2, early day 3 offensive tackles, maybe to be the swing tackle behind Matt Gonsalves, or maybe to, heaven forbid, start over Matt Gonsalves. I think Chase Lunt from UConn makes a lot of sense. Chase Lunt to me fits into what I call the Jackson Barton tier of offensive tackles. That Jackson Barton, the Caleb McGarry tier, I guess. Caleb McGarry never ended up with the Colts, but he was very much a Colts fit back in the day. It's just that, again, that 6'6", 310, 320 pound guy with the short arms and is a fantastic run blocker. Matt Gonsalves fell into this. Bernhard Raimann fell into this. Will Fries fell into this. Braden Smith falls into this. Like, they are all the exact same type of guy. Chase Lunt just looks like that on film. You can watch his college film at UConn, and you could just say, like, oh, yeah, this is a Colts right tackle. This looks like a Colts right tackle. It looks exactly like Gonsalves or Braden Smith on film. So, yeah, Chase Lunt, I mean, I watched 1 minute of film, and I was like, yep, that is a Colts fit right there. And regardless of how he tests, if he tests, I know he's had some injury issues this offseason. I think he could be a good fit for the Colts. And then Ozzie Trapillo from Boston College, massive offensive tackle. He'd be a little bit on the bigger side, like even bigger than Gonsalves, but another guy where the athleticism is great on film. He's very patient in pass protection, and I like a lot of what he does on film. As long as he checks the boxes at the combine, I think that's a guy the Colts could really consider come early day 3. I think he'd be a really good fit for this team. Going to the defensive side of the ball, just looking at some Senior Bowl guys, Donovan Ezeraku from Boston College as well. I hope I said that last name correctly, but he's another guy where you just look at the measurables, just going at the Senior Bowl, and big, strong, super long arms, like the 34-inch arms at edge. I mean, that's certainly a guy that Chris Ballard would covet there. I do think his testing, too, will be very similar to what Chris Ballard has typically drafted at the position. Like, I think his testing will be more straight line than bendy. And that is kind of where Chris Ballard has gone with edge in the past. So I think, when you're looking at how he's going to test, I think that it'll be like an 85th to 90th percentile, like explosiveness score, but probably more like middle of the road when it comes to bend. And that's where the Colts take their edge rushers. You can argue all you want in the comments about how those guys actually have been hitting in the NFL, which has not been great, but that is where he's drafted in the past. And we'll see if he goes that route again. If we're talking first-round edge rushers still, Shemar Stewart from Texas A&M. I know I said this at the end of the show the other day with Ben Boris at Colts Film Room when he was on here, but Shemar Stewart looks like the perfect Dio Adengbo type replacement. I mean, 6'6", 280 pounds, super long arms, explosive and powerful SEC type guy. I mean, look, I don't think the Colts go edge rusher at pick 14, but if they did, Shemar Stewart is just calling, like, it's like the Green Goblin in the early 2000s film with the mask or whatever, just like the inner voice talking to Chris Ballard. Like, he loves taking trenches early. Shemar Stewart is every bit his guy, and Shemar Stewart is the perfect Dio Adengbo replacement. I could totally see a world where Chris Ballard falls in love with Shemar Stewart and just adds another edge rusher with this like bigger type mold to this defensive line to fill that need. So I can't rule out Shemar Stewart at 14, because as long as he checks the boxes at the combine with his testing, which I think he will, he's going to be like a perfect Build-a-Ballard type of player this offseason. Another player to highlight here at linebacker now, Demetrius Knight from South Carolina. Jake has been pounding the table for this guy all offseason. And yeah, I mean, just athletically and also in terms of the measurables, this is a guy who I think is going to be a very, very, very high guy on Chris Ballard's board. I mean, 34-inch arms at linebacker, that's very much in the same mold of Bobby Okereke, EJ Speed, Shaquille Leonard. All of those guys look the same way that Demetrius Knight does on film. So again, as long as he checks the boxes at the combine, that's another guy who I think the Colts are going to be very high on. And then two more defensive backs to go through here real quick. Darien Porter from Iowa State, former wide receiver, moved to corner, and we've done this song and dance before. The 6'2", like 210-pound, 33-inch arms, reminds me a lot of Rock Ya-Sin and Juju Brents in terms of what the Colts covet. I don't know if you'll get to the high end speed that I think Lou Anarumo wants at outside corner, but I do think he's going to fit everything the Colts have drafted in the past at outside corner. So we'll see if they change, a little bit there at corner because of the recent misses. But yeah, Darien Porter is just another guy where it's like, man, I can already see this coming a mile away, that this is the type of guy the Colts are going to like. And then Jonas Sanker, safety from Virginia, just a solid, 6 foot, 205, 210-pound safety who's going to test extremely well at the combine. That's another guy I could totally see the Colts coveting come draft day. So you guys let me know in the comment section below which players you already have circled going into the combine as being pure Chris Ballard guys. And again, I'm not trying to say your favorite players that are like perfect players or anything, but just guys that seem like players he would draft. You guys have seen him draft. It's like 9 times now. It's 9 years of this. We know what type of players he likes. So let me know in the comment section which guys have already caught your eye as being the Chris Ballard guys of this draft. I do want to thank you guys for making Locked On Colts your first listen today. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On NFL Draft with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you guys want to become a Locked On Colts insider and chat with us directly and get that insider scoop, follow the link in our show notes. And if you don't already, make sure you're following at Locked On Colts, at Jake Arthur NFL, and at Zach Hicks 2, all on Twitter. We're also on TikTok and Instagram. Also, subscribe to us on YouTube wherever you listen to your podcast. We love your guys' ratings, reviews, and we'll be back with you guys next week to cover the NFL Combine.